Good afternoon. Is it afternoon already? Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. I bring to you warm greetings from South Africa, more particularly from an organization whose board I am the chairperson of, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions South Africa. Many years ago, in the struggle against apartheid, I was one of those people that was a link between the international liberation movement, primarily the African National Congress, and the internal resistance movement. There were a number, of which the largest was the United Democratic Front. And one of the tasks that I had was quite often in fact, to travel abroad. And whenever I returned from South Africa, my stomach really became constricted, and I had what is euphemistically called butterflies in my stomach. And it was quite a serious condition, because I never knew what faced me once I arrived in South Africa. I was often the police were often in search of me, let's put it that way. In deciding, I first accepted to come and speak at the JVP National Membership meeting nearly a year ago. Things, of course, have changed a lot since then. I have been not sure where I am in the process of evaluating whether I ever want to come to the United States again in these circumstances. I have been part of a discussion on whether we should not be engaged in an academic boycott of the United States, given, first of all, just the harassment that we face, and secondly, in solidarity with many others who are not eligible to come to the United States. And so it was particularly difficult for me with my Iraqi, Irani, and Libyan stamps in my passports, regardless of whether I had gone there for UN work. That's inconsequential. Here they were in my stamps, and so I've been having butterflies in my stomach for weeks before I've come to the United States, and I've never quite experienced this before. Why did I put myself through this? I don't need this kind of traveling in my life. I've piled up enough frequent flying miles, which I never use myself, by the way, give it to others. I didn't need to put myself through this. I hope I don't come across as condescending. I genuinely want to tell you that, quite simply, the awe, the respect that I have for JVP as an organization, for what you embody, for how it is the presence of Jews in the Palestinian struggle for liberation that will redeem all Jews, that will ensure that that struggle doesn't get drawn into a long, drawn-out, dirty, bloodied racial war. And so it is your presence, in the same way that it was the presence of white people in the South African liberation struggle, that ensured that our struggle did not become a racial one. Now, I'm quite sure that the chairperson isn't going to be generous and just let me earn a few extra points by that. But it is JVP that put me through this hell, and I'm happy to have been put through it for what JVP represents. 2 or 3 things very quickly about South Africa. The country's population comprises of indigenous people, and in the later narrative, of the Boers and the Brits. And the Boers and the Brits for 360 years competed for colonial power in South Africa. And all of this, when the elephants fight, it's the ants and the grass that gets trampled underneath. And underneath were the minorities, or the minoritized people. And these comprise of the indigenous people of South Africa, that were the vast majority, of slaves imported from other parts of Africa and from the Indonesian archipelago. That's where my family comes from. And later, migrant laborers brought in from India to do work that blacks refused to do on the sugar plantations. And so there were 4 population groups then. There was the white people right on top, below them the Indian, below them the colored, and below them the vast majority of indigenous people, the black people. South Africa itself, for those of you who know anything about it, it's a stunningly beautiful country. Under apartheid South Africa, or under white South Africa, it became a civilized country. South Africa for long claimed to be the only democratic country in the entire Africa. It was a major bastion of scientific development in Africa. It produced the world's first heart transplant. It gave the world achievements, scientific achievements, such as the CAT scan, such as the very simple creepy crawlies that you've got to clean your swimming pools. It was one of the few nuclear powers in its time. The top 10 universities in all of Africa came from South Africa. A third little fact that you need to know about South Africa that is very, very important to the question of the instrumentalization of the Shoah for occupational purposes. In the battles, in the wars between the Brits and the Boers in the 19th century, the Afrikaners were the victims. 1/6 of the Afrikaner population died horrific deaths in British concentration camps. Thousands of them were women, and tens and thousands of them were children. And so in many ways, the story of apartheid is the story of the suffering and the death in concentration camps of the Afrikaner people. Only much later did I learn that of the total, there was a total of 45 tented camps built by the Brits for Boer internees. But there were 64 for black Africans. So the story of the other victims of the British genocide visited against Afrikaners was never told. Only Afrikaner lives mattered. When the Afrikaners said never again, they meant never again to us Afrikaners. And the deaths, far more in number but unrecorded, of the blacks at the hands of the Brits, those were anonymized, they were walked over, no plagues, no Yad Vashems, nothing for them. And so this repressive regime was, who were they? They were white, they were male, and they were Calvinist. And at some different times, they had defined a collective of 3 other entities as the enemy: the blacks, the Catholics, and later the Jews and the Muslims. There was a strong legal veneer to apartheid, a solid Dutch Roman law system that we had. I got that? A solid Dutch Roman legal system that we had. But in addition to the legal system that underpinned repression, there was also illegal forms of suppression, the targeted assassinations, torture of unspeakable cruelty, the invasions of foreign countries, throwing bodies into the sea. In response to all of this, there was this mass mobilization on the part of the black population, which had now comprised the Indians and the coloreds, who were no longer going to be divided by apartheid categorizations. The question of international solidarity was hugely important. But inside South Africa, there was also sectoral solidarities. In response to this whiteness, we were going to organize along non-racial lines. In response to this gendered oppression, we were going to organize along non-sexist lines. In response to the Calvinism of the regime, we were going to organize along non-racial lines. And so we focused on a limited set of ideals and objects, the end of the state of emergency, unban our organizations, and free our leaders. There was huge mobilization across the countries, at funerals, political trials, the building of organizations, the building of alliances across religious communities and different constituencies. But everything wasn't hunky-dory, and I've got 1 minute left. Everything wasn't hunky-dory. The liberation struggle in South Africa was not this grand movement that we make it out to be. It was a deeply human movement. We killed sellouts in our own ranks. We were intolerant often amongst our own ranks. There was one sector of the liberation movement that went around singing arson, rape, and bloody murder when the Black Revolution comes. We engage in many despicable things. But the bottom line for us was that freedom is not a lollipop that you dish out to deserving and well-behaving children. Freedom is the right of every human being. Finally, I want to say the lessons that we have to offer the Palestinians and those in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. The first is that the method of engaging the enemy must be a reflection of the vision of this new society that we desire. The second is that when we are in solidarity with, then it means that we are accountable to those that we are in solidarity with. It doesn't mean that we abandon our own fidelity to our own beliefs and principles. The second is that non-racialism was in the struggle was the surest guarantee of our ability to establish a non-racial society. The fourth is that there is the timing between resistance and the assumption of power is very important. If we don't look at the dynamics involved in this, invariably it leads to people selling out well before their people have achieved liberation. The second last one, resistance does not end with the attaining of formal liberation or formal freedom. Finally, I want to say that this South African struggle teaches us about the principled nature of freedom, justice, and liberation. That there was going to be no freedom for the black male in South Africa if it did not also mean freedom for black women. That there was going to be no freedom in South Africa. There was going to be no freedom in South Africa for Christian South Africans if it did not imply freedom for Jewish South Africans and Muslim South Africans and Hindu South Africans. That there was going to be no freedom in our country for straight and heterosexual males if it did not also imply freedom for people regardless of their sexual orientation, whether they wish to describe it as such or not describe it as such. So South Africa, comrades and friends, difficult as the post-apartheid struggle is, our people deserved freedom. But South Africa also teaches us that it is possible to destroy the myths of the Goyim will always be the Goyim, that the Palestinians will always hate us. South Africa did show that it is possible to embrace the other. It is possible to forgive. It is possible to reconcile with the other. And of course, along with that, the struggle to untangle the cost and the justice implications of all of this for all of us. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, the one is if very many people get drawn into struggles ostensibly for human rights or broad principles. But the reality is also that people also get drawn in for their own rights. So once we get to a liberation stage, we have attained our own rights. If we didn't cultivate sufficient of a principled commitment to justice, very likely we're going to be stopping at our own rights. And sometimes, not sometimes, but most of the time, another set of ideas set in, and that is, in defense of your own rights, you turn a blind eye to the rights of others. I wanted to get into the House of Freedom. I've rushed through. I'm going to close the door behind me. I'm not going to allow anybody else to come in after me. And so this is the question, the challenge of never again to everybody else. The problem is that there are many people then, sometimes under pragmatism, who says that, look, you know, we need to retain the state, we need to retain the organs of state, the powers, we need to look after the treasury, and they then become the bureaucrats and the politicians, sometimes for very pragmatic reasons, and other times there's a conflation between what is principled and what is pragmatism and what is pure selling out on the other. So at this level, many, many countries that have won their struggles against colonialism, the leaderships of those countries have been a poor reflection of what those struggles are. So in a general way of speaking, we always need to be vigilant, but also vigilant against ourselves. We must never doubt our own propensity to sell out. Selling out is not an act. Selling out is a process. The second point that I want to make quickly is that new forms of injustices reach us. 20, 30 years ago, we spoke about the women's struggle. Then we understood that there was something more to it than just women, that there was a gender struggle. And then later on we understood that, wait, there's more to male and female. There is in fact the idea of the apartheid of gender, binaries. And so our own awareness of oppression and injustice always increases, and this means that every generation must fight new struggles and old struggles over again.